bon après-midi à tout le monde. J'ai la tâche douloureuse de vous garder fully awake après un bon repas cet après-midi. Et je ferai de mon mieux. Après cette introduction, je vais continuer en anglais. Donc pour ceux qui ont besoin de traduction, je vous encourage de prendre les dispositions nécessaires. Thank you very much indeed for the opportunity to be part of this gathering. As we started this morning and the proceedings unfolded, it was difficult not to be nostalgic about some of the very exciting moments we have had here in Senegal and elsewhere around subjects of this nature, bringing together social science scholars from across the African continent, but also the diaspora and friends and colleagues of Africa working in different parts of the world. And I hope as we also go into this post-COVID period that we'll have the opportunity to have many more of such interactions. In many respects, after 2 years of COVID closure and inability to gather in this manner, I think we come to recognize the significance to our well-being, including our intellectual alertness of conferences of this nature, for which I should like to congratulate Mam Penda and her colleagues for an excellent initiative. So recognizing many of the colleagues whom I've not had the privilege of seeing for some time, many from the Codesria network, from ERD network, as well as some new friends whom I feel privileged to meet here. The subject of global political economy of research and research dissemination in Africa is not actually a new one in our discourses. And without repeating some of the key messages that emanated from Mam Penda's presentation this morning, I was telling her at lunch that her address very much mirrors the presentation which I had prepared for this session, and touched upon also some of the points which Godwin Murunga raised around global Africa as a notion and research relevance as a preoccupation. I think that also underscores the fact that we still are grappling with a problem, despite the fact that it is not a new challenge. In terms of the preservation of their own power, concerned that if the university was indeed left to its own devices, it might constitute perhaps one of the most important sources of opposition and indeed threat to the status quo. And so began a very uneasy relationship, a pattern of chronic underfunding that has gone hand in hand with what one might call a pattern of systematic neglect, and the disconnection between intellectuals and policymakers in a manner which, in every sense one can claim with confidence, has severely underdeveloped both the academy and the African countries themselves. If we proceed on the basis that no transformation of society of any sustainable or meaningful kind can take place which does not rely to one degree or the other on knowledge which is generated locally, of an interface between local knowledges and local policy making, if we proceed on that assumption, that rupture of a historic kind which took place between the academy in the quest for the authentic African university as a site of freedom and of liberation, and the post-colonial government in Africa, consumed by its own preoccupation of nation and state building from above in an authoritarian manner. That rupture has produced consequences that continue to follow us to this day, and which in a certain sense define that overarching context in complement to what Mampenda and Godwin Runga said earlier in the morning. In complement to them, that overarching context is what makes it important that initiatives such as Global Africa continue to be pursued. Now, asymmetries at the global level are also, and I will not spend time detailing those asymmetries because I think they are fairly familiar to this audience, but asymmetries at the global level translating into unequal power relationships in the production and consumption of knowledge about Africa and indeed about global concerns have themselves been refracted into the African context in terms of asymmetries that we find playing themselves out with regard to the kinds of expenditure which different governments have put in the post-independence period. And one cannot, for example, compare a country such as South Africa, which although in terms of a global comparative perspective is way behind a country like South Korea in terms of the amount which it invests in higher education, but still way ahead of fellow African countries such as Sierra Leone or Guinea-Bissau in terms of what they put in higher education. So asymmetries of a double nature, of a global asymmetry in research funding, but also asymmetries at the continental level that speaks to multiple layers of inequality and unevenness, and which shape the African context of research and the quest to make sure that it matters. On the basis of this, successive generations of scholars have also tried to exercise agency with a view to mitigating the adverse consequences of these asymmetries. And several of them have been mentioned in passing. I will mention with reference to the particular experiences I have myself been familiar with and involved with regard to exercising that agency. I'll mention efforts at the institutionalization of Pan-African networks of knowledge production as a way of addressing some of the political and knowledge concerns that have mitigated the advancement of research in many of our countries. The role which institutions such as CODESRIA, for example, that has been referenced, and a whole host of others that probably are not as active today as they may have been in the immediate post-independence period leading up to the 1990s, played in terms of filling gaps with regard to the funding of research, but also to the building of networks of a kind that can seek not only to change narratives about the continent, but also to find an entry point for relevance and for engagement with the concerns of the continent. An important part of the story of the post-independence period, which has to be still properly documented. At the national level, precisely also on account of the exercise of the agency of many in the scholarly community, we have seen academics fight battles for the establishment of councils of higher education, for the allocation of research funding by governments as part of the broader effort to strengthen the basis of knowledge production on the continent, to also engaging in a series of policy dialogues aimed at bringing the findings of research to the attention of local policymakers. Some of these have had some success, but it is also evident where we are today that there is still plenty of work that needs to be done. And I don't think anything has demonstrated this more starkly and more clearly to us, if we needed to be reminded, than the COVID pandemic itself, and the way in which in the quest for a response to the pandemic, we found ourselves confronted as Africans with what has been described as a new system of apartheid in the pharmaceutical industry, in which at the end of the day, in a very cynical manner, effectively, Africa was demonstrated simply as a site of experimentation and testing, but never with the power, up to now, as we speak, of being able either to research the vaccines independently or still less to produce the vaccines locally, right? If you have followed the Europe-Africa Summit in recent times, where the vaccine issue was a big item on the agenda, the solution which has been proposed is simply that Germany will be bringing cabins for the production of the vaccines, in which essentially what will be done in the countries that have been selected, including Senegal, will be to simply pour the formula into the vials that will be administered on the African continent. African research completely absent. And I use this example of the COVID-19 pandemic and the way in which the African research ingenuity and voice has been completely absent and emasculated to demonstrate the fact that much as significant efforts were made to exercise agency in the period since independence, we still find ourselves in a situation in which much more, perhaps even more radical, needs to be done. And here I think it's important that as global Africa develops itself and begins to find a niche for itself, clearly understanding that it has a role and a place to play in advancing the agenda of the African university and of higher education more generally, that as it establishes itself, it has to draw lessons from the experiences of the past in order not to commit the errors and face some of the shortcomings that have rendered initiatives of the past from being as effective as they may be expected. And here I have roughly 10 lessons which I think we can take forward as we embark on this journey of global Africa. In the first instance, I believe that all experiences considered from the period of independence to date, it is impossible for us as African researchers to be globally impactful if we are not locally anchored and relevant. I think that's probably a message which doesn't even need to be overemphasized. Any research which might claim a universal validity or a global application begins in the first instance by responding to a local concern. And ultimately, what we celebrate and perhaps even try to emulate as a globally impactful form of research that addresses questions of concern to humanity are indeed questions which begin with a local anchorage. And global Africa will do well by ensuring that the questions which we ask and the questions that it seeks to answer are questions that matter to humanity and to human livelihood within the context of Africa and the African diaspora within which it seeks to define itself. Nobody achieves internationalism of a meaningful and a sustainable kind without being locally anchored. That's the first lesson, which in my own experience, I think we can take forward. The second lesson is that, try as we may, the message has to be repeated and must be underscored that public investment in research is not a choice, but a necessity. Public investment in research is not a choice, but a necessity. And I make bold to say that the existence of institutions such as IRD or the power which is exercised by some of the most globally established institutions of research and higher education around the world owes at least as much, if not most, of its sources to an enlightened and forward-looking investment of public funds more than anything else. And that cannot be short-circuited in our context. Many of you here, like me, have participated in research collaboration networks. We have been funded by foundations around the world. We have been funded by well-meaning sources of solidarity with Africa. You might remember the Canadian think tank initiative of less than a decade or so ago, which identified many institutions, 45 of them at one point in time, with each of them endowed with $1 million Canadian as a way of boosting policy and research thinking on the African continent. And it took a change of government in Ottawa for that initiative to collapse and for majority of those think tanks to pack up and disappear. So that no matter the amount of solidarity, I am not even talking about the details of whether solidarity is altruistic or not. Let us leave that aside. Just simply the principle of it, that there can be no short-circuiting the fact that public funding of research is an imperative to any project of transformation on our continent, if it is to be meaningful and to be sustainable. And it is both a political question, but also a question of citizenship at the end of the day. Because indeed, as we all know as African scholars, and particularly those of our colleagues who work in the NGO sector are aware that a lot of the times, governments that are themselves heavily aid-dependent very easily dismiss research that is produced by an African scholar by saying, after all, it was funded by Ford Foundation. After all, it was funded by Rockefeller Foundation. These are people working for foreign interests, even the most aid-dependent of African governments. And the time has to be now that we call African governments to be responsible to the duty that they have of funding research from the public treasury to the proportion of the GDP which they have that has been defined as an international standard to which many of the countries have signed up without any hesitation, but have simply ignored and neglected over the years. And that is the only pathway by which we can succeed. I can spend the whole afternoon unpacking my path to arriving at this conclusion. And I would not be the first to arrive at that conclusion, because it is precisely because of the limitations associated with international funding, including the donorization of the research agenda, the capture of priorities, the limitation of your capacity to expand and to flower that comes with taking external funding, that institutions like Codessia were set up, and more recently, institutions like Trust Africa were set up. And I can give many other such examples. So I would not overflog the point except to underscore that no transformation actually has been successful in modern history in which research and knowledge have played an important part that has not been on the basis of publicly funded research. And the sooner we begin to deal with this, the better. There are some experiments that are being made in a number of countries. A significant difference was made in a country like Kenya when, under the Kibaki government, an effort was made to revive the National Council for Science and Technology of Kenya. Important investments were made in post-apartheid South Africa with the setting up of the National Research Foundation. And indeed, an important swathe of the research which is produced on our continent today is research that emanates from professorial chairs and laboratories that are funded by the National Research Council of South Africa, giving special longitudinal endowments to promising researchers and their laboratories to carry out longitudinal studies without all of the constraints that are sometimes associated with internationally supported funding activities. Or indeed in Nigeria, that amidst the massification of higher education in Nigeria, one of the biggest victories scored by Nigerian academics after a strike of more than 1 year in which the lecturers refused to teach and the universities were closed for an entire academic year, the government eventually agreed to create what it calls a tertiary educational fund. And the formula for funding that body is a simple one: seed money by government and 0.2% of the profits of all companies that are registered in Nigeria. All companies that operate in Nigeria pay into the tertiary education fund. And today, making it easily the single biggest source of research funding for Nigerian academics. Certainly not sufficient to make the kind of transformational difference that we want to see, but significant enough to at least ensure that those who wish and are willing are able to access research funding within the country in order to carry out agendas that are part of their priority. So ultimately, at a third level, I argue that the one enduring basis for long-term sustainable research is funding that is supplied locally. And when I say locally, it means locally anchored institutions. And to the extent, at a fourth level, that international funding plays a role, and of course, I have absolutely nothing against international funding being accessed. I've done a fair share of fundraising myself in different roles that I've been privileged to play. To the extent to which international funding is accessed, it is important that this is understood as playing a supplemental role rather than the primary driver's role. I mean, I'm speaking in a room that has the current executive secretary of CODESRIA, former executive secretary of CODESRIA, one of the founding spirits of CODESRIA, Mamadou Diouf. And they can tell you, just from experience, what this particular message, key message, means, and how you can have sleepless nights, not just about what to do in terms of paying staff salaries, but just basically keeping your research networks going when international funding becomes the mainstay of your operations. And it takes just one person to decide that actually, I don't like this institution very much anymore. And your entire system will be thrown into disarray. Precisely what happened to the 45 think tanks that were supported by an enlightened Canadian government that saw solidarity as an important part and which was invested in trying to promote African science, but which was replaced 4 years down the line by a different government that was more interested in a Canada first kind of ideology that shut down many institutions of development research in Canada and then proceeded to discontinue the think tank initiative with consequences that were immediate and carried a lot. So global Africa, we need to understand that to the extent to which there is external research funding, and by all means, be creative, look for that funding where you can find it, negotiate good terms on the basis of which you can use that funding, including making the funding as less burdensome as possible, because also, in my experience, one of the biggest disincentives of the funding is the amount of reporting that you have to do on an ongoing basis. You become a report writing machine, essentially. And it doesn't end. The more successful you are, the more of the reports you are compelled to produce in order to keep the machine rolling, and effectively distracting from your primary objective, which is essentially to focus and concentrate on a research agenda that you have defined for yourself. So international funding, given under whatever terms, to be useful and to add value, must feed into, rather than overwhelm or supplant, locally designed and owned agendas. At fifth level, I also suggest that it is critically important that locally implanted systems of valorization of knowledge be pursued vigorously, covering all domains and towards the achievement of what Suleiman Bashir Jain once referred to as the Bibliothèque Africaine. Okay? Absolutely, in my view, again, indispensable. And here I think we haven't succeeded enough. And I'm sure, I mean, again, Mamadou Diouf, 20 years ago was already advising that we do need to have a research information system on the African continent. Why are we not building a research information system that will enable me to be able to read and to understand the ranking of a production of knowledge that emanates out of, say, South Africa, in Senegal, and be able to locate it in terms of the kinds of paradigms on the basis of which we seek to construct knowledge. And many, many, many such initiatives need to be put in place. Who ranks African higher education? Who classifies African research? These are all vectors of power and bearers of relationships of power that we need to find a way to unpack, with a view to ensuring that as part of efforts to valorize research, we do ourselves a favor by constructing institutions of valorization of knowledge on the continent. It cannot be good enough that when we want to know which university counts in Senegal, we start looking for international ranking institutions that rank universities on a global scale, when in fact the relevance and the meaning of Gaston Berger University here in Saint Louis may be completely different from the criteria used by Times Higher Education in London to do its so-called global ranking. And having myself had the privilege and opportunity of sitting on the advisory councils of some of the global ranking institutions, I think I can safely say that there is a sufficient amount of racketeering anyway that goes into the so-called global ranking systems, but which predictably, almost predictably, would place African universities at the bottom of the ladder, no matter what. And we cannot use that as a basis on which to then adjudge, so that it rankles and it pains, and we need to see the connection. When an African minister says that actually, I want to look at governance reform in my country, and I'm going to look at the Kennedy School of Government for advice. Not Sheikh Anta Diop University, not Ibadan University, not Witwatersrand University, Kennedy School of Government. And shamelessly, and we find that repeated every day and thrown at us, effectively producing a vicious cycle in which our own failure to develop systems of valorization as a community also effectively feed into the degradation and denigration of scientific production in Africa by policymakers, a vicious cycle which also goes back to that historic rupture to which I referred. Again, I can dwell on this for quite a bit. It is one of the lessons of experience which I take from my 30 or more years of engagement with fundraising and the financing of research on the African continent. At the 6th level, I would insist, and I think that is an important part of the conceptualization of global Africa, which also speaks to earlier initiatives that have been established on the continent, that we must, as part of a strategic solidarity and defense mechanism, but also the nurturing of a next generation, continue to strengthen cross-border, cross-thematic, and multidisciplinary research. Cross-border research of the kind that makes it possible for me to engage the ideas of a Mamadou Diouf in Africa rather than be introduced to a Mamadou Diouf by a third party outside of Africa. That's precisely what cross-border and cross-disciplinary engagement does for us. I think CODESIA has been tremendously successful in that regard over the years since its establishment. But we need more of it, and we need to expand this significantly in a way that will ensure that we are not only building solidarities across boundaries, but we are also working towards that notion, that ideal of the African university without walls, or Mamadou Suleiman Bashir Diane's notion of the Bibliothèque Africaine. And it speaks also to our capacity to cross-reference one another. To cross-reference one another. It cannot be acceptable in the 21st century for me to want to write about politics in contemporary Senegal and not be able to cite a single Senegalese scholar in my essay, and instead spend most of my time taking my theoretical construction from people who essentially, in some cases, treat Africa in exoteric terms, construct fanciful theories about the continent on the basis of short-term visits, not ethnographic research, and ultimately become the high priests and authorities of knowledge about Africa in a way that makes it impossible for us to have the kind of interaction that is necessary. Of a cross-border fertilization, that means that the student from Nigeria should be able to come and study politics in Senegal and not invest himself or herself in essentially spending time to go and study his or her village at a university in the UK. I did it. I went to do my PhD on industrialization in Nigeria, in Africa, using a northern Nigerian case study at a university in the UK. I'm not saying that it was a bad experience, but I'm saying that if I were to live my life again, and I went to the UK, got a scholarship to go and study industrialization, I'll go and study the history of industrialization in Europe, so that I can also appear on CNN and be an expert on European industrialization. And this is essentially the role which these cross-border things play. If you are going to be an effective and relevant scholar, and you build these cross-border communities of a kind that enable you to understand Africa and then interpret the world through Africa's lenses, perhaps we'll begin to make a difference in the narratives about our continent and about the kind of research which we do. Seventh, to complement the cross-border communities and the local systems of valorization is the important component of local institutions of publishing. And I'm not going to lament the fact that we once had a period in the history of this continent where any university that mattered had a university press. Any university that mattered had a university press. And they were not presses that could simply be shoved aside. They did their best to compete against Oxford University Press, against Cambridge University Press, and all others. We saw in the context of crisis and adjustment how African publishing houses collapsed. We see efforts that have been made by individuals and institutions, again, Codesria Publishing, but also individuals, Africa World Press in the diaspora. Within Africa itself, Per Ank of Ayikwe Ama, or even more recently, Amalium of Suleiman, managing editor in Codesria. All of these efforts deserve once again to be revisited in a way that will enable us to establish and support a vibrant publishing system that will support local journals, that are vehicles of conversations amongst us, but also, when they establish their reputation and credibility, become vehicles of conversation with policymakers. It cannot be possible that in terms of exchanges amongst ourselves, as our journals and our publishing houses have collapsed, and we have to make a career, we end up producing knowledge that is not even accessible to our students because they cannot have access either to the journals or to the publications that we issue in terms of price or in terms of simple basic right of access, where JSTOR or any other such initiative don't make the publications output available. Indeed, we must see the art of production of research as complementary, the other side of the coin, to the art of publication and dissemination. The capacity to be able to distribute, to publish and to distribute on our continent is inextricable from the research production enterprise itself, in which we need to invest ourselves. And I see this as a strategic component of the effort to change the narratives and to change the history. I'm moving towards the end. Number 8. Partnerships are important, as I indicated earlier. But partnerships, please, can never be at the expense of our priorities. Partnerships go a long way to increase our mileage, but it is absolutely important to recognize that the best partnership is the one that accompanies our initiatives, not the one that basically crowds out those initiatives. And God knows that on this continent, we have not had a shortage of bright and good initiatives, such as Global Africa, which ultimately flounder on account of the fact that the nature and the management of partnerships simply makes it impossible for them to grow and to expand to become the force that they need to be. And finally, the knowledge economy is global, without doubt, but it is also riddled with asymmetries that mean that we must always be vigilant in that knowledge economy, not to be consigned as a matter of routine to the bottom of the value chain. There's no point, again, to use the analogy of partnerships in this knowledge economy, to simply be content with playing the role of the data collector, as we saw with the COVID-19 research. A lot of the data and experiments carried out in South Africa, once it was time to develop the vaccines, the South African medical research community was shut out. And the claim in terms of all of what flowed as benefits from that research has simply been monopolized and dominated by those who are in partnership with the Medical Research Council of South Africa. And it's important, therefore, that as much as we want to be part of a global knowledge economy, we must invest ourselves in also building, first and foremost, a local knowledge economy that provides the legs on which we stand when we walk into global partnerships and relationships. I stop here. Thank you very much.